Here's the headline in the Washington Post this weekend. Racist GOP appeals heat up in final weeks before the midterms. Quote, as the campaign heats up in the final weeks before November's midterm elections, so have overt appeals to racial animus and resentment. And the toxic remarks appear to be receiving less pushback from Republicans than in past years, suggesting that some candidates in the first post-Trump election cycle have been influenced by the ex-president's norm-breaking example. Quote, the chief executive of the Anti-Defamation League, which works to counter anti-Semitism, said it is not new to see anti-Semitism or overt racism in politics. What is new is after years in which it was clear that to be credible in public life, politicians had to reject prejudice. It has now been normalized in ways that are really quite breathtaking. He says, quote, I don't know if it will be very easy to put the genie back in the bottle. So, I mean, we're 3 weeks out from Election Day, and that's the message coming from one side, right? Which history is screaming at us about in terms of how dangerous this stuff is. But to win elections, you can't just point at it. You can't just point at anything and say, no, not that, right? There has to be another message. There has to be a competing message, in this case, about why we should stay with political solutions to our problems. We shouldn't blame some mythical other for ruining everything, which requires us to burn it all down and maybe abandon democracy and certainly abandon election results, right? There's a case to be made, not just against what they're advocating, but also why we should keep the democratic system we have had for more than 200 years in this country. And so there's just this incredibly stark contrast for this election, right? On the right, it's all these things we've been talking about, including blatant anti-Semitic appeals from the highest profile people on the conservative side of the aisle, and no negative response to that from Republicans at large. And from the Democratic Party, on the other side, we've got like the most purely practical stuff. It's literally, hearing aids. As of today, you can get hearing aids over the counter, which means they will be thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars cheaper. The NIH estimates that more than 80% of Americans who could benefit from hearing aids don't use them, in large part because they're really hard to get, they're super expensive, and most insurance plans don't cover them, so you have to pay cash. Starting today, you can just buy hearing aids over the counter, which makes it way easier and should bring the costs of hearing aids down by thousands of dollars, which should mean that millions of Americans who need help with hearing loss, whose lives would be seriously improved by having assistance with hearing loss problems, their lives are going to get better. That's brand new as of today. There was a vote 5 years ago in 2017 that made it possible for the FDA to do this and to allow hearing aids to be over the counter. The Trump administration just sat on it for years and it didn't get done. President Biden decided he was going to make it a priority. He signed an executive order in August giving the FDA 120 days to get it done. And they got it done. And now, as of today, life will be materially improved, both financially and in terms of quality of life, literally for millions of Americans who have hearing loss. If you don't have it now, you very well may get it later. I mean, this could benefit something like 30 million people. And that's very practical. And you might see that as kind of small ball politics, but that's the kind of thing that Democrats are putting on the table ahead of this election in 3 weeks. I mean, look at the highest profile actions that President Biden and the Democrats have taken in the lead up to this election. President Biden and Democrats passed legislation to lower the cost of prescription drugs, to literally put a cap on the amount that seniors can pay out of pocket for prescriptions. Republican senators have now introduced their plan to repeal it, to make you pay more for prescriptions, especially you, seniors. Okay. President Biden came up with a plan to reduce people's student loan debt. Again, for millions and millions and millions of Americans, a hugely practical financial improvement in your lives. Republican states are suing to try to get rid of that, to make you pay more for your student loans. President Biden recently pardoned people with convictions for possession of marijuana. I don't think Republicans have come up with a way to challenge that yet, but they're just completely silent on it. They won't talk about it. They're pretending it's not happening. And this kind of stuff, these kinds of initiatives from the Democrats, these are implicitly an argument for democracy, right? I mean, you see where I'm going with this. The way you argue for democracy is not just by pointing the finger at people who want violence or fascism and saying, whoa, that's bad. That always works out badly. I mean, you have to do that. But you also need to make the positive case that democracy is a good idea, that democracy can deliver meaningful, practical improvements in Americans' lives. So I think that's why this election season feels so weird. I mean, there's this mismatch from the two sides, right? Republicans going apocalyptic, end times, end of democracy. A huge proportion of Republican voters, let alone Republican candidates, Republican voters saying unless their team wins, they will not accept the election results as legitimate because election results no longer are the way Republicans want to do things in this country. Meanwhile, we've got simultaneously these overt anti-Semitic appeals from the highest profile people on their side of the aisle. That's what's happening on the right, while Democrats are like, hey, we not only like democracy, we are using our democratic system to do practical things that hopefully help you and your family. And Republicans don't want those practical things to work, but that's the argument from the Democrats. Now, how is this playing out in individual races so far? I believe it is still hard to tell. In Georgia, early voting started today. In Georgia, the Republican candidate in that marquee Senate race there, Herschel Walker, was just asked about the cap on drug prices, including a cap on the price of insulin, which is a life or death necessity for people with diabetes. He responded by suggesting that people really might not need the insulin if they would just eat right. They don't really need the insulin. How's that going to play in Georgia? One party capping the price of insulin so that you don't break the bank, paying for a drug that you need to stay alive. The other party saying, do you really need that?